Welcome, everyone. My name is Cesar Rodriguez Garavito. I'm the co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law and the director of the Climate Litigation Accelerator, or CLX, which is the node, the project that's convening this webinar and also a series of webinars on issues related to human rights and climate change, whose videos you can find in CHRGJ's website. Today's session is on a very timely topic that a number of organizations and researchers and practitioners have been discussing very actively. Well, some of them for years, but more recently with the organization and the convening of an expert panel on Ecocide, this issue has become even more current. Also highlighted by the importance of some efforts by civil society organizations that have developed creative strategies, for example, to hold the governments like the Brazilian Bolsonaro government accountable for the lack of implementation of environmental rules, say the Amazon region. All of these developments, both in academia and in practice, have made this topic of whether or not using an international criminal route to hold perpetrators of ecological harm accountable is a welcome development in terms of speeding up and scaling up action against the environmental and climate harms. Today, to discuss the issue of ecocide, we are privileged to have two prominent panelists with us, Professor Christina Voigt from the University of Oslo, and who's also a member of the Ecocide expert drafting panel, and Ben Batros, who's the Director of Strategy for Humanity and Legal Advisor for the Center for Climate Crime Analysis, and who also spent some time in the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court as member of the Appeals Council. Some of you may be familiar with the drill of how we run these events out of CLX, but I want to remind you that we will have 45 minutes for this public session. We will try to keep the discussion among the panelists to about 30 minutes. But we will be taking questions from the audience or from the participants throughout the session. So please feel free to add your questions in the chat box. And we will do our best to devote the last 12 to 15 minutes to those questions and to have Ben and Christina engage with them. And for those of you who are part of the community of practice of CLX, please remember to log off and then log back on with the other link that was circulated to all of you for the closed door discussion, strategic discussion of this topic. And for those of you who are not active members of CLX's community of practice, just a little note, CLX, in addition to conducting strategic research and doing litigation and advocacy on climate change and human rights with organizations around the world, curates a community of practice, a group of researchers and practitioners from around the world that convene, that get together regularly to discuss forward-looking strategic questions that aim to deepen the impact of litigation, advocacy, and research on climate and human rights around the world. So this is the community of practice that gets together right after the public session. With that, I'll turn it over to Christina to get us started. The floor is yours, Christina.
Thank you so much, Cesar and CLX for organizing this series, for organizing this particular discussion today on the topic of ecocide. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and a privilege being here today. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussions, both with you and Ben and with the audience on that timely topic. Now, to get started, and we all know that there is significant environmental destruction, environmental harm happening. You only have to open the news every day or watch the news. Some of it is willingly, some of it is a side effect of activities carried out. But what we don't have currently is any means under international law to convict perpetrators for environmental crimes under international law. And examples are abundant, as I just mentioned, for example, mountaintop removals or mining, open pit mining, or extinction of species, climate change you already mentioned, Cesar, chemical pollution. The list is very, very long. And the sum of that is very disconcerting. As we know, science tells us in very clear terms and in many reports recently that this affects the living conditions on this planet, and therefore is something that could or should be considered at the same level of the 4 international crimes that already exist. And this is where the idea of ecocide comes in. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, the term, but if you're not, then it's a term of art. It comes from Greek, and it can be divided in eco and side, which means something like killing your home or your house where you live in, destroying the very basics of fundaments of life. And it's certainly understood as severe destruction or environmental harm. And this term has been around for some time, several decades, where it has been looked upon from different angles. The International Law Commission has had a look at it in its work on the draft code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind. We had several legal scholars who have worked on it, one of them Richard Falk, as you may know. But the most influential person, I think, who has dedicated much of her career and working life was Polly Higgins, late Polly Higgins, a barrister from Great Britain. She passed away a couple of years ago, but she really brought the issue of ecocide to the international agenda, especially in the context of an international crime. She actually was here in Oslo. I had the privilege of working with her, meeting her. She held the Arne Næss Chair at the University of Oslo in 2014. And she also set up the Ecocide Foundation, which is currently run by Jojo Mehta, which carries on pretty much the work of Polly Higgins. Now, it is this Ecocide Foundation who late last year, I can't remember when it was, set up this panel of international expert panel of jurists and practitioners and scholars with the aim to draft a definition of ecocide. That panel, you find the composition of the panel on the website of the Stop Ecocide Foundation, is very interesting because it consists of practitioners, of former prosecutors, of judges, justices, of professors, law professors, some with an environmental background, most with a background in international law, particularly international criminal law. So it's a very diverse panel, and it's very interesting and intellectually demanding and challenging work that we've put upon us. So the objective is, as I just mentioned, is to come up with a possible suggestion of a legal definition of ecocide in order to support the work towards an amendment of the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And the aim is to include ecocide as a new international crime in the list of international crimes that we have in that Rome Statute. Now, the idea of environmental crimes is not foreign to the International Court of Justice. It is already partly part of its jurisdiction. Article 82 deals with war crimes, and one aspect to define a war crime looks also at the attacks that can cause widespread and long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, which could be clearly excessive in relation to the military advantage. So in times of war, in the context of war crimes, effects on the environment above a certain threshold is really part and parcel of the ICC's jurisdiction. What it is not is in times of peace. And if you remember the examples that I mentioned at the very beginning, these are activities that are carried out, or omissions that are carried out primarily during peaceful times, activities that are carried out in everyday life, basically, and business as usual. So peacetime environmental impacts are not covered yet by the ICC's jurisdiction. And this is why the panel is working on a definition. Now, the work of the panel is, of course, confidential until we come out with this definition. We are meeting constantly online. Unfortunately, it would be very helpful to sit around the table and discuss this, but so we only sit around the Zoom meeting. But I can't really say much about the status of the work we are doing right now, but I can highlight some of the issues, some of the questions that we're looking at without pointing to the answers, of course. I cannot spill the beans right now. But one issue is, of course, should the definition be general and give broad competence to the prosecutor and then eventually to the judges, or should it be rather specific and list different examples of crimes? If you look at the existing crimes, you have both in the ICC's Articles 6, 7, and 8. Should it just be harm to the environment, purely environmental harm, or should it also include harms to human life, human health? Can it be separated? Does it have to be a part of it? What is the threshold of environmental harm? It's understood as has to be above a certain severity, a certain significance of harm, because basically everything we do affects the environment in a negative way. But in order to be at the level of an international crime, there has to be a significance to the environmental harm, and it's going to be very difficult to draw that line. Is it in terms of sectoral scope? Is it in terms of temporal scope? Is it both? Are there other criteria for drawing that line? Is something that we are discussing. Another question is, for example, with climate change, which is the result of accumulative contributions, both over time and space. Different countries over different time periods, of course, or different actors, not just countries, have contributed to that problem. How does criminal law deal with accumulative problems like climate change or biodiversity decline and degradation? Again, that also links back to questions of causality, which we're looking at, and not the least to the issue of mens rea. Is it something that has to be willfully conducted, or could it also be dolus eventualis, that you just knowingly take into account the potential consequences, harmful consequences of the conduct? So these are all these questions we're dealing with and discussing. And as I said, it's a very, very interesting and difficult and challenging exercise. By the end of the day, if we come up with this definition, it is, of course, something that states need to use or can use as a tool in order to work towards an amendment of the Rome Statute, because it is the state parties to the ICC which would have to negotiate and agree on that. And you may know that the rules for that. Article 121 of the Rome Statute says that every party can make a proposal for an amendment, but it can only be put on the table or taken up if it is supported by the majority of parties. And then it can only be adopted by a 2/3 majority of the parties, and it needs, in order to enter into force, ratification by 7/8 of the parties. So it's a very high threshold to actually procedurally get an amendment adopted. But the definition is like the core element. It's a working tool. It's a suggestion to parties to say, here, this is how it could look like. Take it, modify it, do something with it, but it's a starting point from where you could work. And as you may know, several states have indicated their interest and their willingness to support it, primarily small island developing states. But it is a growing development. And of course, a lot of diplomatic outreach work is done by different actors to, of course, raise the awareness among states of this possibility. What comes out at the end of the day is something we need to see. But what we see already is that the work on it has generated a lot of attention, a lot of focus, a lot of debate, which in itself is or can be really important, because we also see that some states at their national legal system have adopted ecocide crimes in their national criminal acts or even constitutions, which of course is a very interesting development and can then be legally enforced through domestic courts. You don't have to go to the International Court of Justice. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Christina. Now I'll turn it over to Ben and then open it up to questions from the audience. And so a reminder for participants, please use the chat box. We already have a couple of questions. We want to take a few more and then turn to those at the final third of the session. Ben?
Thanks very much, Cesar, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And thank you, Christina. That was a really interesting and useful overview of the drive behind and the current status of the discussions to try to get ourselves a crime of ecocide. And I've got to confess, I feel a little conflicted about this endeavor. And I think that's because I very much bring a practitioner's perspective, but I see it from different perspectives, because for the past 4 years or so, I've been advocating for how law can support and expedite climate action, that sense of speed and scale that Cesar was talking about. And I've often been the one advocating for the creative use of new bodies of law. And so I absolutely understand the desire to harness the expressive function of criminal law in support of climate action and to condemn massive environmental damage as one of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole. But because we've heard about the potential and the reasons why this is important, I'm going to balance that out with a few notes of caution, because I spent the 6 years before that in strategic litigation, where one of the key principles is the need to articulate and critically assess your impact, how any legal intervention will contribute to real world change. And as part of that, I was pushing colleagues and partners to avoid assumptions about the abstract power of law or court decisions, especially when we're facing problems that have really deep social or political or economic roots. And before that, I spent 5 years in the International Criminal Court in the Office of the Prosecutor, and 2 years before that in the Australian government working on international and transnational crime policy. And so I'm acutely aware of the challenges of enacting any new crime and of the limits of international criminal law as a response. And I am, I guess, a little concerned about some of the statements that I've read in earlier discussions, not necessarily in this presentation, but about the prospects for amending the ICC statute. I mean, Christina, you rightly acknowledged the high standard that there is in Article 121 for any amendment, but also of the potential deterrence of the potential for deterrence to influence corporate behavior. And I think some of those assumptions do just merit closer examination. And as part of that, I would actually urge ecocide advocates to disaggregate the discussion of the definition of ecocide from efforts to include it as a crime in the ICC statute, and separately to differentiate discussions of any new crime of ecocide from discussions of how existing criminal laws could address activities that cause massive environmental or climate harms. Now, starting with the ICC, there are questions on whether it would be plausible to amend the ICC statute to include a new crime, whether it would be helpful for the ICC to prosecute an ecocide case. Frankly, I think on any relevant timescale, and I take relevant as within the next 10 years, I don't think the answer is no. As you note, it's a really high standard for amending the statute. But beyond that, the fact of the matter is the ICC is currently struggling. There is a strong feeling amongst many states that the court's already reaching too far beyond its primary mandate. It is stretched too thin, and this is coming at the expense of its capacity to effectively deal with the core crimes that it was created to address. And as a result, even if states are able to muster the will to amend the statute, my assessment is that there is just no realistic prospect that they would prioritize including a new and controversial crime. Any amendment in the next 5 years to 7 years, I would say, is likely to focus on how to strengthen the court's ability to exercise jurisdiction over its current crimes, how to resolve the relationship between court and states, both party and non-party, especially when the early stages of its investigations before it has specific cases. And that brings us to a third problem, both conceptual and practical. The ICC is based on a system of complementarity. States have the primary responsibility to exercise jurisdiction over international crimes. The ICC is supposed to step in only when they fail to do so. So amending the statute to include a new crime that almost no state currently criminalizes domestically is inconsistent with that structure, sorry. I think the idea of using the Ecocide discussions as a platform from which to advocate for a critical mass of states to enact the crime domestically is a much more plausible route to take. And I think that the fact that that's on at least your mind, if you're not being able to speak for the entire panel, but I think that's really, really encouraging. I fully would much more support a focus there, especially given that the nature of Ecocide would also cause problems for the ICC's jurisdictional regime. The ICC is a creature of treaty. Without a referral from the Security Council, and given some of the states involved there, I don't think we're likely to get one in an Ecocide context. The ICC can exercise jurisdiction only when crimes are committed on the territory of or by nationals of a state that is ratified. And that would include a state that has ratified the specific amendment that added Ecocide to the statute. Given that what we would want any crime of Ecocide to cover, much of that has global effects, and I think there would be real tensions there. So I'd question the focus on the ICC, the primary focus on the ICC, at least in the short to medium term. There are also other challenges. You've already identified the challenge of definition. I mean, the harm is not the crime. There is so much more to a crime than that. You talked about the severity, the level of contribution, the mens rea. There's also a sense of what action or omission, the cumulative aspect, what level of contribution. They're really hard problems. And in fact, that's somewhere where I've seen linking Ecocide with the ICC have potentially problematic aspects, because I saw a couple of suggestions, and I don't know whether these were coming from members of the panel. I know a couple of them, but certainly not all. But that you could use the gravity threshold of the ICC statute as a substitute for defining the level of harm or the level of contribution. And that's just a non-starter. Gravity serves as a filter for which cases the prosecutor takes on. There's a large degree of discretion there. It doesn't and it should not define what is and isn't criminal. But also the fact of defining a crime has implications. Obviously, those implications are something that Ecocide advocates are trying to harness. But there are also risks to consider, because states are likely to want to impose a very high standard for what they would criminalize as Ecocide, especially if this is done through an international negotiation process where states seek to reach consensus. And from an advocacy perspective, the risk is that what is excluded from a crime of Ecocide, and there would be a lot that would fall outside any definition, is minimized, becomes implicitly validated. It's not Ecocide, therefore it's not that bad. We've seen to some extent this happen with genocide, where there's a disconnect between the technical legalistic definition of genocide and the public understanding of genocide. And so advocates are always trying to fit the mass violence that they are facing into this technical legalistic definition. And sometimes it doesn't, and it becomes seen as second rate. It creates a separate category that is privileged for international outrage and response. And there are instances in which that is problematic. And finally, I worry that there are a few unrealistic assumptions. Again, I'm not attributing this to Christina, and I'm not attributing it to the panel that is seeking to define the crime of Ecocide, but in some of the discussion around it, unrealistic assumptions about the deterrent effect of a new crime. Statements suggesting that either defining the crime or a single high-profile prosecution is what it would take to shift corporate behavior. The idea that defining a crime by itself will change behavior. I mean, the Ecocide Foundation is doing amazing work at compiling resources around Ecocide. One of them is a list of states that have criminalized Ecocide to date. It's states like Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Tajikistan, Belarus. These are not states that suggest that defining the crime is what it will take to tip corporate or state behavior. Second, the principle of legality and the non-retroactive application of criminal law means that even if a crime is defined, even if it is enacted, It cannot deal with past climate damages. It cannot deal with current climate damage. It cannot even deal realistically with actions in the next couple of years that have massive climate implications for decades to come. It can only deal with actions that take place after that crime is defined. And that time lag and the uncertain nature of any crime, let alone a prosecution, it raises doubt about the practical impacts. Corporations and executives are facing real pressures now from the climate crisis, financial, regulatory, social, and other much more concrete legal concerns. Now, I know that's a whole lot of doom and gloom, and I'm sorry, but I want you to hear these in the spirit of constructive criticism. Where does it leave us? I think there are a range of ways to use criminal and other laws to address the climate crisis without resorting to a new international crime. There are existing domestic laws on environmental damages, corruption, fraud, some of the principles that are being enacted even beyond constitutions. And there are groups that are working to do this. I think there should be more pressure brought on public authorities to make full use of those provisions. I would love to see someone take on the work of trying to amend prosecutorial guidelines in the states that have strong laws so that prosecutors should consider the climate impact of a crime in exercising their discretion whether or not to prosecute. I think that's a low-cost, high-impact strategy that people could take on. I think that we should be considering private prosecutions where public authorities fail to act and where states and where legal systems allow that. That includes states like the UK. And second, there are a growing number of national regimes that allow sanctions on those responsible for or connected with serious human rights abuses. Human rights abuses connected with climate change have already been identified as a priority by at least one such country. I think they should be used more systematically. And even though I've got reservations about international criminal law to address the climate crisis, there are existing crimes that could be used. I'd personally steer away from the war crimes, but I think that it'd be interesting to consider, what does forcible transfer of population mean in the context of the climate crisis? And this sort of comes back to the strategic litigator's perspective. What are we really trying to accomplish through defining the crime of ecocide? Because to me, it feels different if the real objective is to try to get it prosecuted at the ICC, or if the real objective is to highlight the culpability of key corporations, of key executives, of key policymakers, and somehow, as it were, shift the Overton window of what is considered a plausible response to massive climate or environmental damage, and make the use of these other criminal laws or sanctions less controversial and more mainstream. So I'm hoping that that might give a few ideas that we could explore in the discussion alongside the very interesting advocacy work that is being done around the ecocide definition in itself. But I'll pass back to Cesar with that.
Thank you, Ben. And this is a good segue into the discussion, actually, because, well, a couple of questions were already answered by both panelists in the context of their presentations, but I'll start with two questions that push the debate beyond the discussion so far. John Knox, former rapporteur on human rights and the environment, asks the following. In September 2016, the Office of the Prosecutor stated that it would consider crimes against humanity based on certain types of environmental destruction, such as land grabbing. It was anticipated that this could lead to an investigation of one or more situations, including in Cambodia. What has happened as a result of that announcement, and what are the implications for the effort to define ecocide? And then the second question, I will see if we get beyond these two, but because those are big enough. For the second one from Inder Komar, is there any argument that a definition of ecocide already exists in international law, particularly international customary law? Or is there still not yet any agreed definition pending the work of the expert panel and its possible incorporation into the ICC? For example, the ICC's definition of aggression is arguably narrower than the definition under international customary law. So we'll go to Christina first, also to give her a chance to reply to any of the very interesting observations that Ben made, and also address these questions. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cesar, and thank you so much, Ben. I subscribe to most of the comments, if not all, that that you made, and I can assure you that the panelist is aware of most of the issues that you highlighted. It is, of course, a complex question and issue, and this is why in our work we just focus on what you defined as, one of the challenges is how actually would you describe or define that crime. We don't really deal at all with the diplomatic political issues around it. We only focus on that little aspect, which is very, very interesting, and it hasn't to this extent, as far as I know, been done before. We look at previous attempts, but in that particular context. But as I said earlier, if it is really only something that states may want to take further, if they consider it helpful, this is where our mandate would stop. And if states are willing to put it forward as a proposal and get a majority to discuss it and so forth, and even get a 2/3 majority to adopt it, we'll see where this lands. But it is in the hands, of course, of parties to do something with it or not. That is something that needs to be seen. And then, of course, if it were adopted, what the prosecutor does with it, or the prosecutor office does with it, is yet another question, as you highlighted. But it is not a silver bullet. We know that very well. I think everybody understands that very well, that there is a lot of regulation out there. Much more needs to be done. Implementation, enforcement, compliance is often lagging behind for those regulations, that treaties that we already have. And if that were increased and enhanced and more effectively implemented, I think we would already get quite a way further than where we are right now. To the question about John's question on the policy paper that was issued in 2016 from the Office of the Prosecutor, of course, it recognizes environmental impacts or destruction of the environment, but as a result of the existing crime. So you first have to have the existing crime, one of the 4 crimes, and then it may have an environmental impact, and that can be used as a parameter indicator for choosing the cases, but it is inherently linked to the existing crimes. So you have to meet that threshold first before then the decision on the cases can be based on maybe the environmental impact of that particular crime. I think with that I pass on to Ben.
Okay. Ben?
Sure, thanks, Christina. And yeah, I think that's exactly right on the policy paper. It is a question of what are the types of cases that the prosecutor might pay particular attention to, where they constitute existing crimes under the statute. I actually think this is an example of the type of thing I'd love to see more of at the domestic level, where you've got prosecutorial guidelines for how they exercise their discretion, and we see climate impacts. And I think it would have to be more specifically climate impacts, because there are other, more concrete environmental offences that exist at the domestic level, but included amongst the factors that the prosecutor should consider in which cases he or she does take on. Interestingly, the one example that was raised by John of Cambodia is the one example where a human rights sanctions regime has been applied in the context of environmental damage that I'm aware of. In Cambodia, there were some sanctions issued under the Global Magnitsky Act in the US against I think it was 2 Cambodian officials for corruption involved in large-scale land grabbing and deforestation. The other question that was raised, though, had to do with the risk of narrowing a definition as happened in aggression in the context of ecocide. And again, I think that is one of the concerns, that by putting this out in a forum such as the ICC, injecting it into that forum, the risk is that the definition becomes very narrow in order for it to achieve the kind of consensus or widespread support that would be required in order for it to be adopted. And there is always within the ICC an effort to reach consensus amongst states prior to them getting to this 2/3 voting to get it through. I think those were the couple of questions that were asked. Those were the 2 things that I'd want to highlight. Was there anything else, Cesar? Oh, sorry, Christina.
Well, there was a question about international customary law, whether, I mean, you mentioned this. in your second point, Ben, but is there anything more specific that either of you could say about this, the Ecocide already exist in international customary law?
I very much defer to Christina on that.
I was just very interested in hearing what you had got to say. I think we are quite a step away from custom in this field. What we have when it comes to international customary law is the prohibition of significant transboundary harm, as we know. But at the level of a crime, I don't think we have really anything that we can build on in terms of custom with regard to the environmental destruction. But we've been looking at it, trying to find different bits and pieces that we can build on. But as Ecocide, as that concept, I think there's very little anchorage in custom.
Thanks. We had a number of questions about implementation and enforcement, because of course, as you both have said, this is a big challenge, not just for a new crime, but for existing crimes. And in both of your presentations, I kind of detected two potential avenues, and I know that Christina cannot comment on what the preference of the panel will eventually be, but in terms of analytical terms, there seems to be at least two routes towards potentially moving forward with the idea, with that definition of ecocide that the panel will come up with. One would be to go bottom up and work our way upwards from the domestic jurisdictions to eventually, over the years and decades, to some global understanding of ecocide that gets traction at the ICC level. And then there is the other route, which some practitioners prefer because it seems to be more direct and also kind of at the same scale, operating at the same scale as the nature of many of the environmental harms, which are global in nature. One of them being, of course, climate change, which would prefer the international route, the top-down international to national process in which national jurisdictions would vernacularize an international understanding of ecocide that also operates institutionally at the global level, say through the ICC. So in the 5 minutes that we have in our session, I'd be curious to hear a bit more from each of you about the pros and cons of each of these routes, and whether you see any lessons from past efforts, say, for example, the effort to enshrine a right to a healthy environment in international law that could carry over to this new effort. And as we know, the route there has been from domestic to international, now that most constitutions and legislations of the world have adopted a right to a healthy environment. The effort of the current rapporteurship on human rights and the environment is to move that understanding up to the global scale by some sort of international recognition of a right to a healthy environment. So curious to hear your views on those routes in any order. Maybe Christina, you want to go first?
I can try. We don't have a crystal ball to know where we're headed, but of course we see a certain trend that more and more states adopt domestic legislation around ecocide and sanction it and criminalize it, which is pointing towards maybe this bottom-up kind of approach that you're indicating. But ecocides, the idea to call it ecocide is of course closely connected to genocide, and that is something that did come from the top, basically, to spread to the bottom. And maybe we need both. Maybe they can mutually enhance each other. Maybe that initiative can lead to more domestic regulation because it gives an idea of how it could look like. We don't know, but it can go both ways, and I don't think either one is perfectly or is perfect or is the way to pursue, but maybe it is both, as we always see in many areas of international law. And I work primarily on climate change, as you may know, where it is the international and the domestic efforts that eventually have to come together to meet this global challenge.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that especially if you're considering the ICC as a venue, it's a false distinction. You can't separate the international from the domestic because of the complementary structure of the ICC. You know, with such a novel crime and because of the challenges of definition, I think that you would need some sort of international understanding to form the basis for national level implementation of it. If you had every country trying to start from scratch, given all of the challenges that you identified in defining such a crime, I think that would be a problem. So the idea of having an international definition as a template for national states to then adapt to the particularities of their system, the ways in which they define different types of mens rea, the types of acts or omissions that can or can't be included, whether corporate criminal liability exists in their system, what defenses would or wouldn't be available. I mean, there are going to have to be adjustments anytime it's implemented domestically, but I think having a international understanding of the basic parameters as a starting point for states, if you were going to pursue something like this, is the way to go. I think keeping the discussion going in the Assembly of States Parties with a view to an international implementation and the potential amendment to the statute might be a useful prompt for states to move this up the political agenda, but without having a critical mass of states that have criminalized it domestically, or that are at least in the process of doing so, have indicated a willingness to do so, have at least introduced legislation. I just don't think it's plausible for it to be implemented at the international level. So I think you've got to have both the top down and bottom up working. You work from both directions towards the middle in a situation like this, I suspect.
Thank you, Ben and Christina. And this is perfect timing because we have 1 minute in our session. And I'll use it just to thank you both again for making time for yet another Zoom event. But I think that this one was definitely worth the effort. I think that this has offered us in a relatively limited amount of time a good overview of the different options and the arguments for and against various routes towards what we would all like to see, as you both said, increased action against environmental harm at any scale, but particularly at large and very serious scales that we're seeing around the world. And for those of you who will not be joining us for the community of practice segment of this session, by the way, Jackie Gallant just sent around a note in the chat box for community practice members. Please follow those instructions. And for those of you who will not be part of that conversation, all of our recordings, CLX is making all of the webinars available on CHRDJ's website, chrdj.org, closed captioned, and also we will be increasingly making those videos available in other languages as CLX's work continues to expand to different regions. And also you will find in CHRDJ's blog a number of posts that go deeper into some of the strategic issues that we've discussed in the webinars, such as potential rights turn in biodiversity litigation, the discussion of some key ongoing litigation before international and national courts on climate change and human rights. So do visit CHRDJ's website and look for CLX under it, and you'll find a number of resources that we hope will be helpful to researchers and practitioners around the world trying to join the cause or already working on the cause of using human rights and other legal tools to advance climate action. So with that, thanks everyone for your participation, and see you next time.
Thank you, Cesar. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cesar. Thanks, Christina.
Bye-bye.